Hello, it's I, Dr. Ken, joined by my usual teaching assistant, Bear, who is come to join me today. I'm going to talk to you about Ovid and transphobic centaurs. So this was a talk that I gave in Athens, Greece, earlier this year at a conference, and it's based on the work of Ovid the poet from the Metamorphoses, just here. And this is also an article that is in the process of being published, so I will put a link to it in the description. There is another article that this relates to. I'll put a link to that one as well. So what is this about? I had written an article and did another presentation a couple of years ago on a character found in Ovid's Metamorphoses called Iphis, who was born female, raised male, identified as male, and then gets changed into a male by the goddess Isis. And in that article, I point out that Ovid the poet somehow 2,000 years ago managed to illustrate transphobia, gender dysphoria rather, not transphobia. He's done that too. I'll come back to that in a moment. He's managed to illustrate gender dysphoria according to definitions that we have of this. I used an NHS definition for that. So having dealt with Iphis somewhat, I then found there was another character in Ovid that's trans, and this is Caenius or Caenis when she's female, and this is a slightly different case. So gender dysphoria does not seem to be as much in evidence, but Ovid has managed to illustrate once again transphobia, and I've used again a modern definition of that term. So first of all, who is Ovid? For those who may not be aware, he's a Roman poet who lived, his lifespan spans the AD BC era, so 1st century BC, 1st century AD. He was a Roman poet born at the end of the civil wars in Rome, but lived through the early part of what we call the Pax Romana or the Pax Augusta, the Roman peace or the Augustan peace, and devoted his life to writing poetry. Although his father apparently wanted him to become a lawyer. He wasn't cut out for the law. And he wrote on many subjects, including erotic, what we'd call romantic subjects. He also wrote very famously the Metamorphoses, as I've said, which is a book of changes. Metamorphoses is what the word means, to change. And not all the changes are bad. Some of them are okay. Some of them are even good. Most of them tend to be a mixed bag or tend to be unpleasant for the people or individuals changing. Nonetheless, Ovid appears to have been fascinated with the idea of people and gods and other things changing form. And in some ways, I suppose we owe him for spreading this view, for allowing us to have access to this view, or spreading it through literature. Ovid was exiled. He said some things that went against the regime, and he also may have been involved in some kind of embarrassing event involving the imperial family. So he ends up exiled to Tomis on the Black Sea, modern-day Constantia. And there, we know he edited the Metamorphoses, and this will figure into my analysis in a moment. But, well, let me tell you what the story is first. I'll go through the tale first of all, and then I'll say some things about the scholarship and interpretive matters. So in the story, we have the scene is set in the Iliad, or it's picking up a scene from Homer's Iliad, where the Greeks at Troy, Achilles has just defeated one of Poseidon, it would be Poseidon, but Ovid uses Neptune because he's Roman. One of Neptune's children, who was more or less invulnerable, Achilles manages to kill him in the end, and he turns into a bird. Neptune turns him into a bird, his son, to escape. And on this occasion, they're having a feast, and old Nestor, who is an elderly statesman, he's 2.5 centuries old apparently, so he's remembering quite a few things. He recollects the story of Caenis Caenius. Again, Caenius is the male version of the name, Caenis is the female version, who was from Thessaly, and how she got transformed into a great warrior and participated in one of the epic battles of mythology called the wedding of the Lapiths and the Centaurs, or the wedding feast involving the Lapiths and Centaurs. I'll come back to that in a moment, but first the story of Caenius. So we're told that she was I think a princess, but didn't want to marry anyone. She refused the approaches or the advances of numerous men who wanted to marry her. We're not told why. We don't get a great deal of her psychology as we did with Iphis in the other tale, but she doesn't want to marry. And she's walking along the shore one day when the god Neptune, and we'll say Neptune because again it's Ovid and he's Roman. He does sometimes write in Greek, but this was in Latin and he chose the Latin word. But anyway, Neptune, the god of the sea, observes Caenis on the shore and desires her. And trigger warning here that, I mean, as if there weren't, a need, or if you weren't aware of it already, this will deal with some controversial subjects, but I will be talking about the theme of rape, and I do apologize for any that are disturbed by this, although the way that the scholarship has dealt with it is actually quite relevant and interesting, but I'll come back to that again in a moment. So Neptune sees Caenis on the shore, has his way with her, he rapes her, and I don't think he sees it in those terms. I think Caenis sees it as a rape, and he then offers to, as it were, pay her, as if it were some sort of transaction, and she I don't think she sees it as a transaction. Obviously, she didn't willingly submit herself, so that a transaction would seem to require willingness. This is what she says in English, translated from the Latin, when basically Neptune asks her what she wants. She says, "These injuries demand significant compensation. Let me never again suffer such things. Grant that I should no longer be a woman. You shall have then accomplished all that I desire." And these are described as it's a strange prayer that she's uttered here, but interesting that this appears to be what she wants. Maybe it's what she wanted all along. This is something the scholarship sometimes focuses on or questions. I don't think we can know that for a fact, but Neptune is happy to oblige. He doesn't just turn Caenis into a man, who will be called a Caenius, which is the male version of the name, but also makes him an extraordinarily powerful man, strong, rather like Achilles or Heracles. In fact, more like Heracles. He's superhuman. Achilles was too, but maybe even stronger than Achilles. I don't know. And we're not told much about what happens next, except that Caenis is very pleased with this, and then goes around Greece engaging in manly pursuits. We're not told what those are, but we can probably guess. And so some time passes, and Nestor says he then picks up. There's some other bits of the story I'm leaving out, but he picks up the story again at the wedding of the wedding ceremony between a man named Pirithous and Hippodamia. But it's a famous wedding called the wedding feast of the Centaurs and Lapiths. So the Lapiths are the people they are the people of Pirithous. He's a king, and it's in Thessaly, or it's in Greece. And the Centaurs, these half-man, half-horse creatures, they're part of the family. So Pirithous' father, Ixion, who's a problematic character who ends up in Hades, suffering for having, I think, attempted to rape Athena. Anyway, yeah, it's a problematic fellow, but the Centaurs are also his offspring. So they were invited to the wedding. Centaurs are somewhat wild and unruly creatures, and one of them decides that he wants to have his way with the bride at the wedding, and this is not the sort of thing the Greeks are going to allow. So a fight breaks out, and as I said, Caenius is present. Somehow he's present at this wedding. He's from Thessaly. He's from the same sort of region as Pirithous, so it kind of makes sense that he might be there. And we're told that he is at the forefront of the fighting with his superhuman strength. The Centaurs, however, they are aware somehow. They've heard, or possibly the legend is spread that Caenius used to be Caenis, was transformed from a man to a woman, and they start engaging in something that we might call masculine baiting. It's not uncommon when warriors fight to basically compare your opponent, if you're a warrior fighting, to a woman. There are lots of examples of this, where someone who's cowardly, a man who's cowardly, is described as being like a woman. And in fact, I put in the article a list of them. Homer uses this all the time. And so that in some sense is in keeping with standard heroic banter while they fight. But in the case of Caenius, it's a little bit different because he had actually been a woman. And the Centaurs, as I say, pick up on this, and their sort of baiting of him takes on a different dimension. So here is what one of them says. His name Latreus, who's the wildest of the Centaurs, I think. Oh no, he's not. It's another one who's wildest. He shouts insults into the empty air, and this is what he says: "Shall I tolerate one such as you, O Caenius? For you will always be a woman to me, and you will always be Caenis," dead naming him. "Does not the origin of your birth remember you," he says, "and has the very act slipped your mind by which you provided favors in exchange for that false form of a man? Consider what you were born, as well as that to which you have submitted. Then go and pick up the weaving basket and wind the strands of wool with your thumb. Leave warfare to men." This is a pretty scathing insult, and like I said, he has dead named Caenius, calling him by his former female name, and reminding him, in language that, granted, it's poetic and flowery and it's in Latin, but in the English it actually sounds rather similar to the kind of transphobic comments that we find today, especially talking about, remember what you were born, and also to add insult to injury. Caenius then implies, more than implies, that, or sorry, not Caenius, the Centaur Latreus implies that Caenius has bought this false form of a man with sex when he was a woman, which again does not appear to be the case. Caenis, as a woman, did not willingly submit to Neptune, and therefore an exchange of the sort that Latreus is implying is not likely. Well, Caenius makes short shrift of him fairly quickly, and has the kind of epic quip as well when he does so. Caenius says, "Right, let's see how your flesh tolerates my steel," and kills him at that point. The word that I've translated as tolerate, both in Latreus's speech and in Caenius's reply, can mean to bear. So the Centaur might have been asking, "How can I bear you?" And Caenius could be asking, "How can your flesh bear my steel now? See how it bears my steel." But the word to bear in Latin can also mean to tolerate, and the word to tolerate has in it the root word that means to bear or carry, or a different one, but it still means the same thing. So the translation is apt, I think, and it shows quite plainly that this Centaur does not tolerate Caenius, because Caenius has been a woman and turned into a man. So I'll finish the tale, and then I'll come back to sort of an interpretive side of it, if you like. So they fight on. Caenius defeats many Centaurs. He's killing them left and right. They decide to gang up on him, and in the end they heap a mountain on top of him, trees and earth and everything, and asphyxiate him, because even though he's invulnerable, he's effectively immortal, or invulnerable at any rate, he can't be killed normally, he still has to breathe. So there's some sense in which either he dies, or actually he doesn't. Well, okay, so there's a kind of double ending. The Greeks who were watching this aren't sure if he was literally pushed down to Hades by that mountain put on top of him, to the house of Hades, to the underworld, or because what happens next is a bird, an unusual bird, appears flying out of this heap of trees and earth. And a seer, this is a person who sees the future, we're told, interprets this as the final transformation of Caenius, that Neptune, perhaps going above and beyond in his compensation, transformed Caenius into a bird, and he flew away. And so this is what the seer says: "Farewell, O Caenius, glory of the Lapith race, once her greatest hero, but now a unique bird of your own kind." And we're told that that interpretation was accepted by the Greeks present. So an interesting story, and there are a couple of things here worth mentioning. One is that it does illustrate quite aptly transphobia. And in the article I go through, and refer back to this definition. The definition that I have comes from the NHS, from their CAMS, Adolescent Mental Health Services, Child and Adolescent Mental Health Services. That was from 2025. Or sorry, the definition is from 2018. I found it in 2025. This is their definition of transphobia: discrimination against and/or fear or dislike of people whose gender identity does not align with their sex and gender role assigned at birth, or whose gender identity or expression doesn't appear to align. This also includes the perpetuation of negative myths and stereotypes through jokes and/or through personal negative thoughts about trans people. So, taking that definition, it's very clear that the Centaurs in this story are experiencing something that we can identify as transphobia. And this is probably, I think, this is the earliest instance of this that we've ever found. How does Ovid, in the previous one that I talked about with Iphis, Ovid has managed to identify the symptoms of gender dysphoria. This is what the character feels, and she, or he, I suppose, at that point describes, those feelings, and it matches up very well with the definition of gender dysphoria. This instance matches up incredibly well with the modern definition of transphobia. And again, how did this 2,000-year-old or poet from 2,000 years ago manage to come up with this? I don't know the entire answer to that. I know that Ovid seems a little obsessed with trans men, at least based on his portrayals of Iphis and also of Caenius. I suggest that, having been exiled, Ovid would be more keenly aware than most people of what it feels like to be denied something that one considers so essentially one's own. He was in love with the city of Rome, and his exile was exquisitely chosen as a punishment. He was never allowed to return to Rome. He was a very urban-centered individual. His friends, his family, his connections, his fans were all there, but he couldn't return. He wasn't deprived of citizenship. He was probably the highest status person in Tomis, which was a Roman colony at the very edge of the empire. He was a knight. He was probably in charge of that colony, but he hated it there, judging by the poems that he wrote. His Tristia, they're called sadnesses, and his Epistulae ex Ponto, or letters from exile, from the Pontus. So I suggest that him having to live the rest of his days in exile may have something to do with it, that he would understand, like I say, what it's like to be denied something that's so essentially a part of oneself. There's more to it than that. Ovid is almost certainly what we would call a heterosexual, unapologetically. I wouldn't say he's homophobic. He writes in some of his poetry, he doesn't understand what same-sex relations, or how they could be, interesting or fun. But that's just him. He's the one. It's his experience. And I think because he can identify with a man, he identifies with men, and he identifies with sexual penetration, which is how Roman men actualize their masculinity, and that's apparent from his other works. So I think he could put himself, with considerable empathy into the sort of mindset of someone who's, say, physically female, but wants to be male and feels male. So I think it's Ovid's unusual or unique character and his background and experience, but it makes him unusually, extraordinarily sympathetic to trans men, to the plight of trans men especially. So in terms of interpretation, I thought I would look at the scholarship and see who's actually written on this. This is due diligence in classics and ancient history to do this. But I was a bit surprised, well, maybe not too surprised, but the first article I could find, the earliest article I could find that talked about this episode from the Metamorphoses was by a fellow named Seaman, and it was written in 1937, which is quite interesting considering what else was going on in the 1930s. Of course, the first recorded medical sex change occurred in 1931 in Berlin. And great strides were being made at that time in surgical and gender-affirming treatments, especially in Germany and Austria, at least until a bit later. And around the time that Seaman was writing the article was when the Nationalsozialismus thugs, the Nazis, started burning books at Nuremberg and other places. And the books that they mostly burned were those on transgender medical science, because they took that somehow as a personal insult, anyway. So Seaman's article from 1937 is relatively neutral. All he's really doing is just talking about this, and he refers to a couple of other instances, and my impression is that he's doing, in a sense, a bit like what I'm doing, which is just to try and raise awareness, to talk about these things in a fairly neutral terms as scholars, and to try and divorce it from some of the emotive or excessive trigger factors that other people have about this. Because if everyone's shouting, it's not going to be possible to develop any sort of understanding. I also point out that in the year 1937, which was when Seaman's article was published, although he would have been writing it earlier, a 7th century BC bronze relief of Caenius and the Centaurs was discovered at Olympia. So that may be another factor in Seaman's article, because that bronze relief would have been of interest to classical scholars at the time. It would have made the news, and maybe he's responding in part to that. But what's going on in Germany and Austria in the 1930s clearly has an impact. And like I say, Seaman's article it's not bad. It doesn't say a great deal, but it's not critical either. It's just sort of, as I say, in some sense raising awareness in a neutral kind of way. The subject doesn't get picked up again in scholarship. At least I couldn't find it. I know I've scoured the sort of databases that we have at our disposal. There may be other things out there I've not been able to find, but the next person to even mention this in any detail is a scholar named Zumwalt in 1977. And in that article, Zumwalt is mostly just focusing on the literary and kind of Homeric features in Ovid. So her position is that the story of Caenius is meant to be taken as tongue-in-cheek, that it is it's a parody of Homer, essentially, and not to be taken too seriously. So according to Zumwalt, Caenius is heroic in quotation marks, as I've dropped my thing. It's not, I wouldn't say the article is overly condemning Caenius or seeing Caenius in too negative of a light, but it does play down the heroic quality quite a bit. And that in and of itself could arguably be considered transphobic, because it's treating this character as something like a joke. And there is, don't get me wrong, there is an element of humor present in Ovid. He is parodying Homer to some extent, but as I point out in my paper, you can have humor with an edge. You can have dark humor, or you can have humor that both makes you laugh and makes you think, and I suggest that this is of that type. The other scholarship that dealt with this mostly came in the sort of 1980s. So we get quite a bit of feminist scholarship. They're mostly focusing on the rape scenes, though, because this is, so the 70s, it starts in the 60s actually, but in the 70s and 80s we get a lot of feminist scholarship looking at instances of rape in particular in works like Homer as well, but also works like Ovid. And they're often being critical of earlier scholars in the 20th century mainly, but before sometimes as well. Earlier scholars who maybe played down the instances of rape or used the language of romance or boys will be boys kind of thing to excuse it. And so that I think that's very important and relevant scholarship. But they tended to regard Caenius more in terms of the rape than in terms of the trans issue. So trans issues don't seem to have been really on the radar. There are, as I say, and then more recent scholarship, like in the 2020s and as recently as 2025, has been focusing a bit more on the trans subject, but not a great deal. So is there a kind of implicit transphobia within the academy? Maybe, I don't know. But as I say, some scholars do take issue with, say, for example, Zumwalt's article from the 70s and challenge that position. Northrop, I think, is one that does that. Again, if you're interested in the article, I will put a link to it when it is published. It's still in press. It will be out very soon. So some of the scholarship will consider Caenius to be, well, either some kind of lesbianism maybe, or I've seen arguments for asexuality, that when she was a woman, Caenius was asexual. I'm not sure about that. Certainly as a man, the implication doesn't seem to be that, but hard to say. It is worth noting that the final transformation of Caenius into a bird is consistent with other elements of other instances in Ovid where a character has been raped. Sometimes they do transform into birds. It's not too uncommon, actually. So obviously Caenius wasn't raped in the end as a man. That was part of being made a man, but you could interpret the kind of the Centaurs heaping a mountain and trees, I guess, could be phallic if we want to be excessively Freudian, that the final defeat of Caenius by the Centaurs, when they all gang up on him, could be considered something like a rape. And then, as I say, he's transformed into a bird. So, like I say, the scholarship has focused a lot more on that. Let's see, and yeah. Like I say, there's not been a great deal on this, or what you'll find more often than not is something on Reddit or self-published. There are beginning to be more works on this, but not as many as you might think. There goes Bear. So that in essence is all I wanted to say about this episode. I don't know if you want to know where it is, if you want to find. It's at the end of book 9 of the Metamorphoses. That's where you'll find the story of Caenius. As I say, it's interesting at a number of levels, and one is that it illustrates transphobia in a day when they wouldn't have even known the term, but it does fit our definition remarkably well. The other is that, as I say, within the scholarship, there had been perhaps a trend to disregard the character of Caenius as laughable in some ways, and that to me does imply some transphobia on the part of such scholars, and that reputation has been somewhat repudiated a bit later on, as I say, with more recent scholarship. It is only in the very recent scholarship that we start seeing, and it's Northrop who wrote Caenius and heroic transmasculinity. When was that? So that article came out in 2025. So yes, that's the most recent thing I could find on this, and it's essentially taking issue with Zumwalt's position and arguing, as I do, and as I agree, that Caenius is heroic and should be regarded as such. And Ovid seems to be portraying this character in a very positive light. So that's all I wanted to do is to bring this story into the light, if you like, and let people think about it, and I suppose in the grand scheme of things, whether this tale or the tale of Iphis who gets changed into a man, it's a god who does it. So there have always been trans people, and they would have been aware of these stories at some point. Maybe it offered them some hope. I don't know. As I say, it would only be in fairly modern times that something like sex change surgery and gender affirming treatment would be developed. Although it is worth pointing out, in the course of researching this, I did come across an interesting episode that Ovid would have been aware of, and I think Seaman mentions this as well in his article. There was a case from, well, it was reported in a source from the 1st century BC, before Ovid's time. He almost certainly did, in fact, we know, read this source. And it refers to apparently a woman named Calo, who was born, but without any kind of obvious, and again, trigger warning here, but without any sort of obvious genitalia, and just a sort of urethral outlet. She ends up marrying a man, but can't have intercourse, so they don't. But then a kind of tumor develops in the region of her crotch, and she goes to a physician who ends up performing surgery, and it turns out this individual was actually intersexed, and there was a penis and testicles, but the penis had no hole or outlet for the urethra, and the surgeon used a silver catheter to redirect the urethra through the penis. And so this is not exactly sex change surgery, and this is in the 1st century BC, almost certainly at Alexandria at the medical school, or certainly as a result of that. But that same surgery, basically the same type of it, is used today to treat this same condition. They made some significant advancements in medicine in the ancient world, and this was one of them. So in some ways, the beginnings of gender affirming treatment and transgender surgery, transsexual operations did start in the ancient world. And like I said, Ovid would have been aware of this case of Calo. He changes his name to Calon once he becomes fully masculinized. But Ovid would have been aware of that. There are other instances as well that are referred to like this. So it's not just in mythology that we find instances of at least intersexuality, but the same sort of theme. And the ancients wouldn't have understood in the way that we do these things. But it goes to show that the conversation's been going on for a long time, and if these people like these centaurs show transphobia even in mythology, even in the ancient world, and that illustrates that transphobia has also been with us for a very long time. It's up to you if you want to read this and what you make of Caenius as heroic or not. But I encourage you to go out and explore more and learn more about these things. Thank you for your attention. As I say, there will be links in the description to these articles.
果てしない空になりたい